the clinical value is very important, but I was also asked to tell you a little bit about trust, because of course we do need the clinicians to trust artificial intelligence in order to actually use it. And this is at the moment quite a hot topic. And of course, clinical evidence is one of the factors contributing to this. So my talk will be a little bit different from the usual talks. It will be more like a vision, my personal opinion that I from my experience over the years. And yeah, welcome. So let me introduce myself. I'm almost a radiologist. I will be finishing my residency early next year, and I work currently at the Amsterdam UMC, but I was trained in UMC Utrecht in the Netherlands. So I got interested in artificial intelligence in 2017, as I'm also an epidemiologist by training with a focus on statistics. And I just saw that it was going to be very big, and I just wanted to know everything about it, and to improve my beautiful profession and also as a personal hobby. So this became quite big, because as such I got a number of functions and I listed them here. And I'm also a reviewer for a couple of journals, and basically I'm just a very busy and motivated resident. So there has been this talk about if artificial intelligence is a hype or is not a hype. Some say this is now, artificial intelligence now, but then quantum computing will be the next big thing. Well, that might very well be, but all these techniques or trends have something in common. They are data-driven. And that means that medicine will actually become data-driven, and that is something very new. We humans are not totally used to that yet. So it's not only about the techniques, the science, or the AI, machine learning, deep learning, but it's also the human side, more the soft factors and the human-machine interaction. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. So there's an information overload for us clinicians at the moment. When we look at all these new words, H-level 7, interoperability, harmonization, this is not common lingo for us. We sometimes feel overwhelmed by all these new terms, and some of us can get very intimidated by this, and then fear arises, and we don't feel likely to adopt these new techniques. So actually, I've been talking about this quite a bit with my colleagues, because I'm super excited about artificial intelligence, and I am wondering why not everybody is sometimes, or people might be hesitant, or well, I think this is common knowledge now. And I've asked why, and actually what they will tell me is this. I had one girl asking me, is there still hope for me as a simple radiologist? And this is a very smart lady. So, you know, what's important about this is that apparently radiologists or other clinicians have the conception that artificial intelligence is so difficult that it's not for them. So what may happen then is that we don't use it to our advantage. And I would love to prevent that from happening, as I really want to move the field a step ahead, right? So what happens then? People feel overwhelmed, people become anxious, and because of this information overload, and it induces fear. You also have to realize, I don't know if you know, but radiologists are already overwhelmed by ever-increasing workload. And actually many of our colleagues are facing a burnout. This is of course also because of the COVID, but also because of the general development in our field. So the first reaction then is doubt, and fear and doubt are obviously the opposite of trust. And that may lead to no adoption. So I think we all know this this curve. Actually, 2 years ago, I wanted to study whether we can, what are the factors that bridge the chasm between the early adopters, the innovators, early adopters, and the early majority. A couple of years ago, we were at the innovator stage. Right now, I think a couple of clinics already use artificial intelligence, but it's not widespread. I mean, a few narrow indications are like nodule assessment or small task, narrow tasks are being done, but it's not, there's nothing automized yet. So how to bridge the chasm was my research question. And as such, with a colleague from Stanford, we did a large survey in over 1,000 radiologists and residents worldwide, but mostly Europe though, assessing the knowledge level of current radiologists and seeking relations between the knowledge level and fear of replacement and likeliness to have an open and proactive attitude towards AI. So this resulted in 2 papers. The talk is too short to tell you a lot about it, but they're in European radiology, they're open source. It has 2 parts. The first I just told you about is about fear of replacement, knowledge, and attitude towards the topic. So attitude, in other words, being an early adopter. The second part is about expectations regarding AI to the field, hurdles to implementation and education. So the main results of especially part 1 are this. So this is 2 years ago, but still I think, I don't think has changed much, maybe a little bit shifted to the left, but this is a measurement of self-declared AI-specific knowledge in radiologists. And you can see most of them consider themselves having basic knowledge. And some even never heard of it. So this will not be the case anymore, but still, of course, we are not experts yet. So the main results of the part 1 were also fear of, that's a mistake, fear of replacement. We found fear of replacement by AI. So the radiologist fears being replaced by AI in almost 40%. I think it's a bit lower now, but still, this is considerable. And then an open and proactive attitude. This means that you are likely to become, actually, no, I'm not explaining it correct. An open and proactive attitude means here that you're likely to take a risk, which is either time, your own time, or skipping your lunch to investigate or try a new AI tool, right? Or ask a colleague, how does it work? Take a little risk and really wanting to do that. So we found that almost 50% of radiologists is actually willing to do this. So this is very good news. And we also looked how we can actually change people in the sense that from an early majority to make an early adopter. And this is by increasing the knowledge level. Actually, having only rudimentary AI specific knowledge increases fear for replacement and decreases a positive attitude, so open and proactive attitude. But then increasing knowledge levels actually decrease fear and increase an open and proactive attitude. So there's a big need for education. So data has a better idea, maybe, yes, but we humans need to trust the ideas first and also correct those ideas where necessary. So the way I like to explain it is that AI, to my colleagues, is that AI is a medical device, and we know how to work with those. We know the types of risk and the type of frameworks around medical devices. And then AI is just, well, this is very simplified, but it's a formula, right? That is too complicated for me, and it's certainly not linear like this. However, you can just kind of see it as a tool. As a very complicated formula. So this, I think this is very simplified, but I think you get where I'm heading. Besides from education, I think there also needs to be education, or we need to work on the human-machine communication. And here I'm talking about, for example, bias. There is automation bias, which is that as a person, as a human, you tend to trust the computer even though he's wrong, and they can be very wrong. I'm not going to show you examples, but we've all seen those examples, I think. And then also we need to focus on multidisciplinary decision making amongst us humans. And what I mean by this is that we need to speak each other's language. There is data scientists, engineers, clinical epidemiologists such as myself, radiologists such as myself, and industry representatives, and those all speak a different language. And there's the ethics. There's a very complicated topic, but basically the way I see it is that the next generation of digital doctors needs an expansion on their Hippocratic oath, right? Do no harm, but do no harm with the help of machines as well. So this means it needs to be, artificial intelligence should be incorporated in medicine studies, so that we get a feel for the type of errors that machines could make, and the risks that come with that. One of these risks is an algorithm not being fair. We've all seen examples of studies where a certain group gets disadvantaged because the algorithm was trained on another group. So, for example, there's this, there's this study where arthrosis was underestimated, osteoarthritis was underestimated in Black people as opposed to white people, just because the algorithm was developed in relatively healthy white males. This is a common problem in medicine, by the way. So, and there's bias. I will talk a little bit about that later. And these are just, when we talk about bias, these are just basic biostatistics and data science concepts. And I think we need a little more education on that as doctors, as a group. So that is my my story about trust and evidence. And I also would like to tell you a little bit about the more scientific part. Right now, we're in an era of guidelines. That is to say, we realize now that for standardization of processes such as study development, but also the reviewing, but also, for example, what if you as a radiologist would buy, you want to buy an AI solution? Where do you even start? What do you ask a vendor, and what should the vendor answer? Well, these are all things that can be described in guidelines, and I wanted to point out a couple of those. There's the ECLAIR guideline. I will highlight this in a little bit, that I really like. This is really about what questions to ask relating to all these steps in the entire pipeline where bias can arise. There's this excellent article by Van Timmeren and al. This is more about radiomics. It's a little bit different, but this is if you want to review papers, for example, on radiomics, or even understand the clinical validity or scientific validity for that matter of radiomic studies. This is an excellent review explaining all the different steps. Also, I'm also involved in development of these reporting guidelines, Tripod AI and Probust AI. Tripod and Probust are reporting guidelines for prediction algorithms, diagnostic or prognostic, but not tailored to AI. But right now, these are under development. So these pertain to studies, though. This is if you want to review or read a study to really understand where bias can arise. So I would recommend these to look out for those. And then this is also an excellent source. I can really recommend it. Radiology Artificial Intelligence is a journal of specific journal of radiology of RSNA, only talking about publishing about AI. And they have a checklist for specifically for artificial intelligence in medical imaging. so radiology. And this is basically a rough translation of what is in tripod and probust AI, but then really applied to medical imaging. Those are also algorithms, for example, applied in ICU and just medicine in general. But those are all imaging guidelines. So whenever I speak about, sometimes I present about risks of bias in algorithm development. I hope we still have time. Franz, do we still have a bit of time? Otherwise, I might skip.
Yes, yes, we have still a little bit of time.
Good, thank you.
Like 5 more minutes.
Great, thanks. So something I would like to explain to you, more the scientific part, is that when developing an algorithm, it has a couple of steps, right? So first you want to think about the intended use, like what is my algorithm for? What clinical question am I going to answer? One, and is that clinical question relevant? That is our jobs as clinicians, right? So, so the intended use, with that in mind, we take a sample out of a source population. Source population can be anything like Americans or Dutch people or women, but it has to correspond to your intended use. So if you want to apply this algorithm to women, for example, you cannot take a sample out of, let's say, older men, if you want to answer a question for younger women. So this is something you have to consider when designing a study, right? So it's roughly like this. It's very, I can talk for hours about this, but this is, sorry. That happens when you present from home, right? So the cats visit. So you take a sample, then you have your data, right? And this step actually, do you see my mouse, by the way? But I don't think so. But the first 3 blocks are the most work, I think, in research. So data has to be cleaned, so to say. So you have to check for outliers, you have to check for distributions, etc. You have to, maybe some data are mislabeled, and then you go to the labeling. So in clinical epidemiology, we would say this is the reference test. So this is for supervised learning, by the way. So and so you can label in many ways. You can let a human do it or do semi-automatic, or there's many steps, but you have to think like, is my method suitable for my intended use, right? So, and then the pre-processing, this, for example, the radiomics article I just showed you talks a lot about the pre-processing in radiomics, and there's very many steps that are not standardized at the moment. So I think for all those steps, we should have some level of standardization. And then there's pre-processing of the data, and then the imaging data, for example, and then the algorithm is developed, right? So there's a training set and there's a validation set, and you go back and forth tweaking the parameters, but this can also be done in multiple fashions. So all those steps, we need to be aware. How is it done? Do others do this as well? And you have to report, you have to be transparent when you do a study like that. And this is described in these reporting guidelines. Then we go to internal validation. This is where you just do the test once of the algorithm, and then you see if your performance drops or not. And if it drops a lot, it was overfitted. And then you can still alter some things, but this is actually the internal validation. Then you go to a different sample, maybe of the same source population or a different source population, and then you apply the algorithm again, and then you would have the true validation. Now we see that most of the performance drops, and actually most of the studies that I review are still in the internal validation phase. They're a proof of concept, and they show pretty good performance, but on their own testing set. So we haven't seen very many studies yet where external validation, so on a different sample, maybe from a different source population, is done. And then, so generalizability relates to how does this externally validated or not externally validated algorithm perform in my population, in my personal hospital, the chest x-rays I read, those patients, how does my algorithm perform? So there's also a lot of work on that. That's a field that's very much in development. There are no standards for it yet, but there should be some form of quality assessment and quality control should be in place. So, and then we go to the clinical value. Then we have to see, ideally with prospective studies, whether the algorithm that we use on our local patient population adds something, and you have multiple ways of adding something. It's either faster and then not worse and not more inconvenient for the doctor or for the patient. It's either better, the quality is better, the outcomes are better, survival is better, or it's faster or more accessible. So there's these three goals in healthcare in general. So the triangle of the iron triangle of healthcare. I don't have a slide of it at the moment, but and this is roughly how you assess clinical value. So this should be done in prospective studies, ideally randomized, ideally, but I don't think for algorithms randomized is there's so many applications. Randomized clinical trials are very expensive as well. So yeah, we're still looking for the correct form, and I think time will tell. So I'm going to skip the ECLAIR guidelines, I think, because we're running a bit out of time, but this is basically part of what I just told you. You can read in the ECLAIR guidelines, and this applies to what can you ask your vendor, or what can the vendor tell their clinician. So especially the first few questions are just what I told. So to wrap this up, I think we need to build trust for AI by clinician and vendor education. And we need to focus on understand of where bias arises and also by focusing on standardization. This is the era of the guidelines. So I think much of our effort should be geared towards that. And this is also the multidisciplinary age. We need to speak each other's language. So that was what I had to say today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merel, for this really insightful talk. I found it really exciting to listen to your talk and get your experience and your insights and your perspective on all of those highly relevant topics. So I already wrote in the chat, so maybe you can just ask your questions by the Q&A feature. We will gather those questions and then in the panel discussion, then raise those questions. So we will go on to the next speaker. Thanks so much, Merel. We'll go on to Chiranjeev Singh. He's the Chief Commercial Officer of Cure, which is one of the leading AI players in the radiology domain. Chiranjeev has a very long history in healthcare, in various leadership positions at GE Healthcare. And before he joined Cure, he was Chief Marketing Officer, X-ray, and the Global Marketing Director, Diagnostic Cardiology. And he will give the first perspective on the clinical value and how clinical value is created by commercial products. One of the three speakers that will now follow. And I'll hand over to you, Chiranjeev. I think, Merel, you need to stop sharing.
Yeah, I know.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Franz, for the opportunity, and thank you, Merel, for a wonderful talk. Let me share my screen. And I will, using Cure as an example, talk about where we've seen real clinical value, where we've been able to demonstrate actual usage on the ground. Just a quick intro about Cure. I'll not spend a lot of time on this. We are a company that's based out of India, been in this industry for the last 5 years. So we're one of the very early companies which started building algorithms in radiology. We today have more than 100 employees, have been growing significantly since our inception, have a very large database. Today, our access is of more than 8 million scans that we have acquired and have access to from around the world. Our solutions are obviously compliant as per regulatory requirements, privacy requirements, and also regulatory cleared by both US FDA, CE, as well as at least a dozen other markets. And I think one thing which we've built our base on is independent validation and research. There are a lot of AI developers, and one thing that I believe and we at Cure believe is not, and I tell all our customers, don't trust us, trust yourself, trust your own data, and as a starting point, trust independent peer-reviewed research. So to the point Merel made a short while ago, we have a good growing list of research where it was on a completely independent data set, had no allegiance or no sponsorship by us as the vendor or the industry partner, and still have done independent validation of our algorithm. Before I started, I saw a question on the chat saying, are there any studies which are comparing multiple AI products? And the answer is yes. We actually have 3 of them. One of them mentioned here. There are 2 others where there have been more than one AI product for the same use case or same clinical application, which has been compared. And I can, on the chat, share links. I think the most important thing I would point to, and I think Merel also referred to it in her talk, is what I call choosing the right nail. I think a lot of conversations I get into, you cannot solve or come to value without first answering what are you solving for? What's the clinical problem? What's the workflow issue? What in engineering term is the use case for which you want to use the AI? Till at the hospital level, till at the radiology level, we see clarity on that. It does not translate to real value. And the examples that I'm going to share after this, I just have picked up 2 examples of where we've delivered it. I would give a lot of credit to the clinicians in defining and choosing the right nail, as I say it. The first example I would give is from VRAD. VRAD, for those of you who may not know them, is one of the largest teleradiology providers in the United States. Very high volumes, maybe 5,000 exams a day or near about. And a good chunk of this volumes comes at night from emergency rooms around the US. So if you're familiar with the workflow, any exam that is ordered in an emergency room gets ordered as a stat. And VRAD had a real issue in the sense that every exam on their work list was a stat. Now, if everything is stat, everything is urgent, you really lose the significance of what really is stat. And the nail of the problem they identified was, how do we get a reliable and trusted solution to truly identify the real stat exams to be read? And there was, they wrote a blog about it about 2 years ago. They did a lot of validation of the solutions in the market. But what I'm sharing today is a real patient story that was shared with me a couple of months ago, where there was a patient who visited a rural hospital in Iowa post an accident with a head injury. As per the protocol, was scanned through CT. Now, the AI in use immediately detected intracranial hemorrhage and also a midline shift, and moved the study to the top of the work list for the radiologist, and was assigned to a neuroradiologist who was actually sitting in California, which for people who are not from the States is almost 2,000 miles away. So, if you're in Europe or in Asia, this can be a different country. Now, the automated notification system not just prioritized the scan to the top of the work list using the AI interpretation, but the system at VRAD is so advanced that it also connected the reading radiologist to the ER physician, and the patient was moved to the OR. Now, all of this was achieved in less than 3 minutes. And while I don't have follow-up data to share about what was the final prognosis for the patient, I can definitely, I'm sure all of you would agree, was a real impact where a normal protocol or a care could have taken minutes, or if in many countries or many scenarios, an hour. Getting that outcome in less than 3 minutes, getting a radiologist in a different part of the country to first pick that scan out of maybe 20 other scans that were in his or her work list, shows the real impact where AI can translate it not just from a clinical outcome, but for a real patient life. The second example that I would share is with the work that we were fortunate to do with a trust in UK, with the NHS Bolton Trust at the start of the COVID pandemic. We were in conversations with the trust for quite some time. And March of 2020, when the COVID cases were at a peak in the UK, one of the chief radiologists, Dr. Malik, whose quote I've placed here, put forward this proposal that they need a strong AI solution to allow the clinical staff in the hospital to get 24/7 decision support. They did not want to wait for just the 9 to 5 staffing hours for the radiology department. They also wanted us to not just help identify and help them in triage so that any patient that's coming to the hospital can be immediately identified as critical, non-critical, whether they need to be put into an ICU, whether they need oxygen, but also worked with us to develop a patient progression monitoring score, where along with other clinical parameters, along with monitoring oxygen levels, along with measuring temperature, saturation, we used AI to reliably compute a percentage of lung impacted. And that became a part of their clinical protocol. They were using that along with, as I said, other parameters to decide when to move a patient to an ICU, when to intubate a patient. And this was one site where the usage of the AI solution honestly spilled beyond the core radiology users. It was everybody in internal medicine, everybody intensive care, honestly, everybody who was taking care of the COVID patients at that point. And we did a lot of work on this field at other sites as well, in Italy, in Boston, and is another real example where the AI tool was able to get into a real clinical workflow and deliver value. It's reached a level today where this hospital actually has patient education posters educating their patients that their radiologists are actually using medical AI to read X-ray images. And they've been part of a new case study done by Gartner. They've won multiple awards by various organizations for the actual deployment. What's next, and this is my last slide, is something that we are right now working on. We were recently awarded a significant award by the National Institute of Health Research and the NHSX, where we are taking, again, the ER triage algorithm that I mentioned in my first slide with BRAD, getting into a deployment pan-UK, and the objective of this award is not to prove clinical accuracy or not to get into sensitivity or specificity metrics, but really to get a health economic study to translate the value into pure workflow and economic terms. So we have a health economic agency involved as part of our consortium. We have a patient representative involved, and it's a very collaborative exercise where we intend to, over the next 12 to 18 months, prove real hard numbers and metrics on the impact of using this AI to NHS as a health system. That's all from my side. Thank you, Franz and the deepc team, for the opportunity, and happy to take any questions later. And you can also reach out to me through our website or on my email, which is my first name dot last name, chiranjeev.singh@cure.ai. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chiranjeev. This is great and really impressive data and very, very insightful data. I will not lose any time because we are already running a little bit late in time, and pass on to the next speaker from Gleamer. It's Alban Grandjean. She is head of marketing and clinical affairs at Gleamer, a French-based AI company. She was also before at GE Healthcare many years, amongst others, commercial excellence leader Europe and PET-CT and radiation therapy product manager Europe. So over to you, Alban. I'm very excited to hear your talk.
Thank you very much, Franz. I hope you can see my screen.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And hopefully what I will show is not too redundant with what the two first panelists have touched. Just a quick word. So Gleamer is developing AI solutions in radiology and focusing to start with on conventional X-rays because it's a mainstream, as you know, a high volume examination. It's difficult actually to read. It's tedious, and it's usually a first-line exam that is really the entry point of patients into their diagnostic and then a therapeutic pathway. The idea was with a first solution to focus on a product on trauma X-ray, which is called BoneView. So just very quickly before I jump really into our topic of interest, BoneView is an AI system for bone trauma X-rays. It detects initially fractures and is now expanding to detect effusions, dislocations, and bone lesions on most of the anatomies except C-spine and skull. But it works on extremities, pelvis, TL spine, and rib cage on both adults and pediatric population. And of course, it is CE marked Class 2A and since recently 510(k) pending. Just a quick look on how it looks like, just because it will ease the clinical studies that I will share afterwards. The idea is to send directly in the packs a summary table with the overall AI result, as well as secondary captures. So we replicate the native images with bounding boxes around the region of interest. And this is what you can see here on this very subtle pediatric fracture of the proximal phalange. We also point out, of course, the overall number of areas of interest to make sure that they can all be reviewed by the reader. So when it comes to validating AI solutions and really building trust, as Merel was explaining, there are a few options that exist and that are being widely used by AI companies to validate AI solutions. The first type is standalone AI performances, and that's really the basis for regulatory approval, for, of course, testing and validation, as the end phases of R&D development. And it really makes sure that we understand the AI performance by itself. It's an interesting format of study or methodology because it's quite easy to automate. It's cheap, or let's say cheaper than other designs, and it can quantify a potential benefit when compared to reading performances without AI of radiologists or other clinicians. The downside is that it really does not reflect any actual clinical usage. It's really reflecting a potential benefit, but again, it really doesn't say, just like a new drug, it doesn't say unless you do a proper clinical trial whether it's actually going to work in a specific clinical situation. Another type of design that is quite widely used is what we call MRMC, so multi-reader, multi-case studies. And here the idea is to compare reading performances of radiologists, or again, other types of physicians involved, with and without the help of AI. It usually requires a complex design just to avoid biases like crossing the design or washing out periods between different exam reads to make sure that there's no memory. It requires as well quite large data sets, as well as large number of readers. So on the plus side, it actually reflects the actual efficacy of AI. So whether the results of the AI would be actually followed by the reader, or if they would be disregarded in clinical practice. And on the downside, it's an expensive design, again, because it requires a large number of readers and expertises and a large number of cases. For both design and study designs, a key really is the ground truth and how the gold standard is being established. And that's something that really has to be carefully reviewed when looking at study results to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what kind of ground truth was being used. So to go into a concrete example, I'd like to highlight a recent publication in radiology focusing on bone view and on measuring reading performances of both radiologists and emergency physicians with and without the help of bone view. Of course, it is focusing on an independent data set that was not, of course, part of the training sets, not part of the testing or validation sets either. And it's important to know that it's a European data set, so it reflects, of course, a European population. So about the design in this study, we collected 600 examinations over a 3-year period, coming from distinct X-ray modalities to really have different representations of vendors. It's coming from 17 different medical centers in France and cover 6 distinct body parts. Out of the 600 exams, half of them were negative, so without fractures, and half of them were positive, so with at least 1 non-obvious fractures. So all the obvious fractures, for example, largely displaced, were removed in order to really stress the performances of the algorithm. The ground truth was established by 3 experts radiologists. Actually, 2 of them performed an independent reading of the entire data set. And whenever there was a discrepancy, the case was reviewed together with a 3rd MSK expert in order to establish a consensus. The study by itself evaluates the reading performances of 12 readers, 6 radiologists, and 6 emergency physicians with different levels of seniority. And each of the readers read the entire data set, but half of it with AI and the other half without AI. And it was a cross design. So half of the readers started with AI and the other half started without AI. And that's also important because a quick anecdote, we realized, and we can actually show that there is a learning curve. So readers starting by reading with AI actually improve their performances even without AI later on, which is an interesting also topic to evaluate when we talk about skill evolutions in the environment of AI. So on the results, we were able to demonstrate an overall reduction of missed fractures by 30%. So it's a reduction of the false negative rate by 30%. If we put, of course, all the 12 readers together, an overall increase of 12% in sensitivity and of 22% in sensitivity for exams with more than 1 fracture, which is not a surprise. I'm sure you're all familiar with the satisfaction of search bias, which explains it. What's interesting, of course, is to look at the gain in sensitivity and, of course, in specificity as well for the different reader populations. So you can see that both population, so radiologists and emergency physicians, benefited from reading with AI at different levels. But really, what's interesting to see on the left side, hopefully you can see, so the circle is really the zoomed version of the ROC curve and focusing on the reader performances with and without AI. What's interesting to see is that the combination of readers and AI actually surpassed the performance of AI by itself, the red curve being the AI standalone performances. So it's quite interesting. It really shows that, putting humans together with AI in this case can be really beneficial, and that they really overpass the performances of one another. Question can come, and was touched a little bit by Merel on generalization. So we have replicated that type of study on American data. And the good news is it's showing similar performances. So it's showing that at least on the American population, the algorithm is able to generalize quite well. Of course, it would have to be tested on other types of data sets to expand that claim, but that American study is being reviewed as we speak. Another example of study design is a retrospective study on a natural data set. So here we collected, without any selection, 3 months of consecutive trauma X-rays. And the idea was to compare the radiology reports that were collected together with the X-rays, together with the AI findings. What's interesting to see is that out of all the fractures reported in the ground truth, radiologists saw 668 of them, and the AI saw an additional 235. So it's really 235 fractures that were not reported in the radiology report. And the AI did 17 false negatives, so 17 fractures that were seen in the radiology report that were not detected by the AI. That data set is interesting because it's a natural prevalence, so it allows to calculate a relevant negative predictive value that was measured at 99.5%. And again, it's quite important to note that these NPV is only relevant on natural data sets. It's just an example of a retrospective study that's more focused on standalone AI performances and on measuring the potential benefits of AI on a natural data sets. Out of these, the question is, of course, what's the clinical impact? So I will go very quickly, but we are pushing this study to measure what's the impact for patients based on these 235 fractures that were detected by the AI on top of the ones that were reported. And we can see that 26 of them were severe fractures. So really implying a risk for the patient. And for quite a number of patients, a different management should have been required, including complementary CTs or MRs or surgical consultations. So that kind of study allows us to say that there is, out of all the exam population, there was a 5% medical error rate when it comes to missed fractures that could be recovered by using the AI. But of course, this would need to be proven in a prospective study, for example. And out of all cases with a missed fracture recovered by AI, 3 out of 5 patients should have been managed differently. So again, we try to move into the space of measuring the clinical impact of AI in the workflow. A couple of examples, just showing you. Sorry.
We don't have so much time left, so it's really, really impressive data. So maybe you can come to an end.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go quickly. So just sharing a few examples, and maybe I'll move quickly on the clinical side. So just showing you that maybe just on this case here, the AI system detected a fracture of the acetabulum roof. The radiologist didn't buy it, but still ordered an MR, given the clinical data as well. And that patient actually had a fracture of the acetabulum roof with a splitting line. So this is just an example of how AI is starting to change how patients are being managed. Just so to finish this talk, my first point would be, if you need to take home a few things, be careful with the numbers. We need large-scale studies and rigorous methodologies to avoid biases. And as Merel was saying, AI education is really a must, including understanding what are the clinical validation parameters. The ECLAIR guidelines are definitely a good framework to evaluate available solutions. As Shiranjeev was saying, performance, but also health economics and workflow outcomes are going to really be the key to understand the impact of AI. And for sure, the race has started. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alban, for sharing this really impressive data that you have produced with Gleamer. So that's definitely going into the right direction and can serve as a great example for a whole industry. Thanks so much for sharing those insights. I directly hand over to Victor because we're a little bit late in time, but it's so exciting. So I see that all the participants are staying. So thank you so much for your interest. And I just hand over to you, Victor.
Dinner and the audience. So that's a challenging position, but I hope I can engage with the audience and make sure that that everybody is still there when we round off. So Franz, please confirm if you can see my screen. And
perfect, beautiful.
So what's this? Good, here we are. AI translation into clinical value. With Aidens, we also have some ideas about that, and I'm very glad, Franz, that you invited us to talk about that. A little bit about Aidens, because maybe not the full audience has heard about us. We're a Dutch company. We're based in Amsterdam. We were founded about 6 years ago, and we started to roll out our clinical product, our clinical AI product, our medical device, as Neil used to refer to them, 2 years ago. Meanwhile, we have grown to about 60 people with offices in London and Amsterdam, and we currently serve around 50 sites across Europe. Recently, we were MDR certified as a Class 2B product, and I think one of the key points where we differentiate with is a very rigid focus on quality and regulatory compliance, simply because it's a medical device we're dealing with. So a little bit about the product. The product is called VI Long Nodules, and VI Long Nodules is an AI-based clinical solution for lung nodule management on chest CTs. So it basically automatically detects, measures, classifies, and also tracks the growth of lung nodules as small as 3 millimeters. The product, VI, delivers its analysis directly into the radiology workflow as part of the original PACS study. As said, CE certified according to the latest medical device regulation, and we're also aiming to go across the Atlantic very soon. The use cases are around incidental lung nodules, but also a very strong use case for dedicated lung cancer screening programs. So the question you asked me, Franz, was about the learnings and what we believe how AI translates into clinical value. And with that as a briefing, I thought about 3 learnings that we shared here in Amsterdam with the Aidens folks that I also would like to share with you. The first one is the proof of the pudding. And a second learning is all about learnings we had and really applying them. And the last, but definitely not the least, is human sense in AI. I liked the story of Merel very much. She was focusing on the people behind the algorithms. She was focusing on trust. And I think that is also a learning we would like to share with the audience. So let us go to the first learning. The proof of the pudding, as you know, is in the eating. That means there is no clinical value of an algorithm if it's not being used. And it sounds weird, but in the end, that's really a point that I would like to convey to this audience. Because what we often say here with Aidens is that it is not only the algorithm that is making a difference, because the true differences are made by the deployment in clinical practice. Because it's not only the algorithm that matters then, but it's really using it and making sure that it is truly capable of being used in clinical practice. And I think that is very important point that everyone in the audience also needs to realize if they consider AI, because it's not only the algorithm. So much more things, and Franz, I'm sure you and your team are working hard on these kind of things, but so much more is used and needed and required to really make sure that such a medical device is also operating in day-to-day practice. So here a few of the examples how we bring it into practice in Europe and in more specificity in the UK, where we're happy to serve many hospitals for both clinical routine as well as for large-scale lung cancer screening programs. So a second learning is learning quickly and also applying this. So let me refer here to an article that was published in Forbes a year ago. And it dealt with the insights we all gained from Google's attempt to really enter the healthcare space and why they basically failed with their healthcare algorithms. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you see what the article is summing up. And the first one is very interesting because it's not only the research, it's not only the data science, but it's definitely also engineering. It's all about how to productize your algorithm, because in the end, that product, which is a medical device, also needs to be integrated in existing IT systems and needs to be maintained. It needs to be deployed. There needs to be post-market surveillance. And we think that it is fair to assume that from our angle, roughly 5% of our R&D budget is very much focused on algorithm development. So the data science and the algorithm development. However, the other 90 up to 95% is all allocated to truly productize it. And that means IT engineering, that means software development, that means Q&R. And that's so much more important to make sure that your AI solution sticks in day-to-day practice. The second one was about science, engineering, and process change. And of course, also their comment that healthcare AI models do not generalize. Now, we got a few other standpoints here, because on the second point, we do not fully agree with the article, because we believe one of the key essential topics to ensure that AI is truly adopted as a day-to-day tool is that you need to support your users. Dedicated supporting your users. And on the third point, we do believe that you can generalize AI models as long as you do have enough quality data. So let us go to the third learning. And this is about the human sense in AI. And I hope you will see some bridges to the previous speakers, because in the end, there is so much more than an algorithm. And let me share with you what I mean with human sense. The first thing is that we're all humans, and humans simply do not like change. So that means you need to make sure that your workflow is not changing, and that a radiologist does not need to open all kinds of new windows, has new devices on his desk, needs new logins, new windows on his computer screen. Nothing of that. You want to make it as simple and as straightforward as possible in order to make sure that it's truly convenient and easy to use. So no change in the workflow drives adoption of AI. And that's what we're trying with Aidence as well. So a second one regarding the human sense is, of course, the evidence. The previous speakers also referred to a few very strong articles and publications to show that it is truly making a difference to use AI, and that the clinical outcomes, but also the economical outcomes are there. So more than happy to engage with the audience in a one-on-one conversation to talk about our publications, including a recent study on efficiency that showed us an efficiency gain of 39% if the readers are using an algorithm like the one we bring to market, but I'm sure there is many more out there that come up with a similar kind of efficiency gains without compromising on clinical outcomes. So evidence, something people need. And the last, but definitely not the least, is again the human sense that it is about people. We really want to be close to the clinicians. We believe there is a benefit in a shoulder-to-shoulder approach, making sure that you drive adoption, especially the first months. So for that reason, we always have dedicated teams to the people out there in order to drive that adoption shoulder to shoulder. And with that, Franz, I give the floor back to you. I hope it was well in time. Thanks, Franz.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Victor, for this, again, a little bit different perspective and really, really insightful perspective. In the rush, I just forgot, and I apologize for that, to actually introduce you properly. So Victor is the Chief Commercial Officer of Aidence and has many, many years of leadership positions and leadership experience at Philips, amongst many other positions. And thanks so much for your talk, Victor. So we are already a little bit over time, but nevertheless, we would like to have like a very, very brief panel discussion. And I would pick up questions from the Q&A, and I've prepared some questions, and I would hand over one question to every one of you. And I'll start with Merel, actually, because she will need to leave soon because she has a follow-up meeting. So Merel, thanks again for your great talk. It was very insightful and super exciting for me, but also for the whole audience. I would be very interested if you have like first experience of AI in clinical routine you could share, like how AI algorithms have been used at the hospitals you're working at, or colleagues that have been working with AI solutions.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Thank you, Franz. Well, one hospital I've worked at recently, they're now using a pulmonary embolism detection tool. So meaning that within about 30 minutes, the answer yes or no, so a dichotomous answer will be given whether the patient has pulmonary embolisms or not. So, and this is then, the radiologist will see this in the corner of his screen as a pop-up. So it's very interesting how quickly you actually trust the tool. Because at first I was hesitant because, you know, I know all the risks and I'm always talking about the risks. So, but and they were wrong twice actually, because, but still, you know, still the 20 times they were right, and quite difficult pulmonary embolisms as well. So yeah, I don't know, I think it's very helpful because especially when you have in clinic, you have many scans, long lists, and sometimes you have pulmonary embolisms that are incidental, right? So with oncology follow-up. So especially for those cases, I think it's very good that you would get an alert. But there's also a flip side. Potentially that would have clinical added value because then you would have a diagnosis. However, we also know that smaller pulmonary embolisms that are very peripheral, meaning very far out in the lungs, are not so clinically relevant. So I think we're still in the beginning of this whole process right now, where we get a prompt when there's a pulmonary embolism. Will it be clinically relevant? Will it improve patient outcomes like survival or quality of life? We don't know. So I just see this as the first steps, as narrow tasks, and yeah, so that is so far my experience. And right now I'm working at a hospital where they use the stroke viewer. However, I'm in MSK, musculoskeletal, so I can't really comment on the experience, but I'm definitely going to ask, of course. So, yeah.
Super cool. Thanks for sharing those valuable experiences. And talking about health economic outcomes, I would have a question for Chiranjeev, because you mentioned your new initiative with the NHS, and yeah, congrats to that, by the way. So how are you planning to measure health economic outcomes in this kind of evaluation, and what are you looking at?
Sure. So I think as I briefly mentioned, we have a proper health economic study that's being designed as part of the deployment. There is a health economics agency which is working with us. And we are looking at measuring two distinct outcomes. We're measuring the time saving, the time to respond to a critical incident when it comes to the emergency room, in terms of how fast can you get thrombolytics, how fast can you get a clinical decision for the patient, and also trying to look at an economic saving in terms of measuring quality of life, measuring, faster diagnostics, and therefore faster treatment and decisions for the patient. So we're looking at it both from efficiency or a workflow gain, as well as looking at quantifying the quality of life improvements that we can do by using the AI in that scenario.
That's great. So I'm getting absolutely thrilled about seeing the journey of AI, like from the hype in the beginning, like the performance of the AI models, now to clinical workflow evaluation, and now going even a step further to measuring like health economic outcomes, and then eventually also patient outcomes. Thanks a lot for sharing this with us. So I have another question towards Victor. So with Aidence, you have gathered a lot of experience over the last couple of years, also with large-scale deployments of your solutions, creating clinical value already at many, many sites. So what would you consider the biggest challenges in getting hospitals to adopt AI? Michael Pfeiffer wrote that question in the chat. And maybe together with this, where do you see the biggest roadblocks?
I would say the biggest roadblocks is that it's new and that it doesn't automatically fit hospital budgets immediately. It's not a line item, like, for example, a CT or a pen they need to order, right? So that's something new. So you're really confronted with a very complex DMU where everybody has an idea about AI. So it's really a very first roadblock. And then the second one I would refer to is maybe the point of fear that Merel also pointed towards, which of course in the end can be tackled by simply starting and give that shoulder-to-shoulder support, because that in the end helps these people to overcome their first mental blockers or fears. And that is our experience so far, that yeah, it's very time consuming. It requires a lot of investment, but in the end, we get there together.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. So one last question to Alban. Also, thanks a lot for your talk, Alban. And you showed us very impressive clinical data that you generated together with radiologists, clinicians, and your gleamers technology. So from your experience, from all of this data, what type of clinical measures are resonating most with the actual customers and are most convincing to those customers?
So when it comes to, it's a difficult question. When it comes to triaging patients, for sure, indicators like the negative predictive value. So for example, being able to confidently discharge a patient from the emergency room, or at least handle that patient when the AI tells you that it's negative for fracture, is something that's powerful and that's resonating, because it directly impacts workflow and how decisions can be made. So that would be one example, but then for sure, I would say the combination of sensitivity and specificity are still quite important, but again, they need to be compared to the actual sensitivity and specificity of readers, so radiologists or the clinicians, to be relevant and to show an actual gap. Again, as in reading performance studies, so with and without AI. So these resonate pretty well, but again, as it was mentioned earlier, probably health economic outcomes are going to, I don't want to say prevail, but are going to be the key to justify the investments and to make sure that healthcare institutions really go all the way to purchasing these solutions and completely integrating them in clinical practice. But again, first, I think the major ones are demonstrating that it increases quality of care is really the key in our field. Demonstrating that diagnostic performances can be improved is already an amazing start, because it's already all over the literature of what happens when patients are being discharged with fractures that are unknown. So I would say that it's really the combination, and probably the next piece is going to be measurements on how it improves the workflow. So for example, how it actually speeds up reading time, or speeds up again, or reduces waiting time in the emergency room. Those kind of, I would say, more workflow outcomes are going to be important as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing this piece of data point. That's really great. I'm only left with saying thank you to all of you panelists. Thank you to the audience. It's really terrific how much interest there is in those questions, like how we can really translate AI into clinical value and even go beyond this. So thanks to all of you. We're closing this webinar now. Sorry for being a little bit late today. But it was so exciting, and I think everyone got a piece of really insightful information out of this. I'm only left to say we are very pleased to work with such amazing partners as all of you. Yeah, thank you and see you at the next webinar.